Hello students, welcome to the EPG Patashala. I am Professor Gaurinath from School of Life Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Today I am going to talk about module on structural levels of proteins and their stabilizing forces from biomolecules and their interactions. So the objectives of this module is to learn the organization of protein structure like primary structure, secondary structure, tertiary structure and quaternary structures, and what are the forces that stabilize the protein structure. So in the primary structure, we all know it is arrangement of amino acids in linear form, but don't forget the disulfide bridges are also part of the primary structure. In the secondary structures, we will learn details about the alpha helix and beta sheet, what kind of hydrogen bonds are formed. Tertiary structure, we all know that the secondary structures come together and arrange themselves to form a tertiary structures. These tertiary structures arrange themselves to give a quaternary structures. The quaternary structure can be a same polypeptide or a different polypeptides will form a quaternary structure. And there are different forces that stabilize the protein structure like hydrogen bond, van der Waals interaction, electrostatic interactions. All these forces stabilize the protein structure. In this, we will all discuss what are the forces which actually stabilize the protein structure, which is the dominant force in the protein structures, and how these structural energy component of these forces can be calculated to give a total energy of the protein structure. Now, these different energy potentials in the protein structure which you can calculate the total energy of protein structure, and what are the uses and where we use this term. Proteins are made up of amino acids. Amino acids are covalently connected by peptide bonds and make protein. In general, there are about 20 amino acids which are naturally occurring and very dominantly occurring. Proline is one of the amino acid. We call it as amino acid, but actually it's an amino acid. Other than these 20 amino acids, there are many forms of amino acids. They are modified. They exist naturally, but very rarely. So amino acid, as the name says, it has one amino group, one carboxy group, and a side chain. Primary structure. Primary structure is basically the arrangement of amino acids, how they are connected to form a protein. Basically, it tells about all the covalent bonds formed between the amino acids. So when I say covalent bonds, it also explains the disulfide bridges. Which of the cysteines are forming disulfide bridges. It shows the amino acids, when they are connected, the peptide bonds are formed. The peptide bonds are planar in nature because the two electrons from nitrogen and carbonyl group where the electrons can exchange and the CN bond becomes a planar in nature. And whereas the two other single bonds, the NC and CO, are single bonds where the conformation of the amino acids can change and can lead to different structures. Secondary structures. The secondary structures are well-ordered local structures. These arise due to non-covalent interactions and where the covalent interactions do not play any role in this. The hydrogen bond interactions of the backbone NH and carbonyl groups define the secondary structures. So the hydrogen bond with the NH and the CO which define these secondary structures. Each secondary structures adopt a similar kind of phi-psi angles for the backbone irrespective of their side chains. Like examples, all the alpha helices will have a similar phi-psi angles and all the beta sheets have a similar phi-psi angles. Now the first time these secondary structures were described by Linus Pauling and Robert Corley, who first described the alpha helix, and he almost said that the problem of protein structure is solved. But later, after few years, he again proposed the model of beta sheets. At that time, there were no protein structures were discovered or determined by any method. Alpha helix. Alpha helix is a right-handed helix where hydrogen bond is formed between first and fourth amino acids, or N plus 4 amino acids. In a right-handed alpha helix, there are 3.6 residues per turn, and each turn the helix raises by 5.4 angstroms, and the distance between the two residues is 1.5 angstroms. Generally, the phi-psi angle for alpha helices is minus 57 and minus 47. We could also say 60, minus 60, minus 50. In the alpha helix, all the carbonyl groups are in one direction and all the amino NH groups are in the other direction. Because of this, the helix will have a dipole formation. Alpha helix. There are several residues which prefers to form alpha helix, like glutamic acid, alanine, histidine, leucine and methionine will prefer to form alpha helix, and they generally exist in alpha helix. There are many residues which are also alpha helix breakers. Specifically, the cluster of beta branch residues, example isoleucine, threonine and valine, hinder the helix formation. And if you have a glycine in between, also break the helical structures. The membrane spanning helices generally have only hydrophobic amino acids. Alpha helices are not exactly cylindrical all the time. Suppose if a proline residue come in the middle of the alpha helix, because the proline doesn't have NH group, it cannot form a backbone hydrogen bond. It will cause a distortion. Similarly, if the glycine comes in the middle of alpha helix, because glycine doesn't have any side chain and is very flexible, can also distort the alpha helical conformation. And major factor is helices when they are exposed out to the solvent, and most of the globular proteins where the helical alpha helices are exposed to the solvent, the alpha helix bend to form a curved structure so that it can interact with more water and form hydrogen bonds, and due to which you have a curved alpha helical structures. Alpha helix can be represented as a spiral wheel model, where we all know that alpha helix there are 3.6 residues per turn. That means per each turn there are about 300 degrees. So 3.6 residues and 360 degrees per turn, that is about 100 degrees rotation per each residue along the helical axis. If you look at the spiral wheel, each atom, each amino acid you can draw along the spiral wheel as shown in the slide. So if you draw the amino acid sequence in a linear form in the spiral wheel form, and you can identify where this helix can exist in the protein structure. As example, I have shown you in the spiral wheel where the charged residues are polar residues like asparagine, aspartic acid, glutamic acid and arginine are all coming one side of the spiral wheel, whereas all the hydrophobic residues like isoleucine, phenylalanine, leucine are coming one side of the spiral wheel. That clearly describes that these charged residues are exposed to the solvent, whereas polar residues are inside the core of the protein or forms the core of the protein. So while looking at the whole primary sequence, you may not able to identify what kind of helix this will form. But once you put the amino acids in the spiral wheel, then you can able to guess where this alpha helix could be forming. So this will give a lot of information. Once you represent the amino acids in a spiral wheel form, we can easily identify where this helix can form, whether it is in the core of the protein, or it's a transmembrane helix, or the helix in the surface of the protein structure. Beta sheets. Beta sheets are also called as extended structures. Beta sheet generally by itself does not exist. They two or more polypeptide chain run along side by side, and the hydrogen bonds are formed between the two chains. There are 3.5 angstrom residues between the residue. And in the beta sheet, the two consecutive side chains are opposite to each other, and similarly two carbonyl groups are opposite to each other. So the carbonyl group and side chain of the same amino acids are perpendicular to each other. The beta sheets, as I said, you need two or more sheets to form beta sheets. So these sheets could be a parallel or anti-parallel. If they are anti-parallel, the hydrogen bonds are more straight and the distance between the two sheets become smaller, and they are more stable compared to parallel beta sheets. In many structures, you also have mixed beta sheets, where the combination of parallel and anti-parallel beta sheets. The beta sheets, as I said, we may say are parallel anti-parallel beta sheets, but they are not exactly like railway tracks. They're always twisted by 25 to 30 degrees. So you always find a left-handed beta sheet twist in the protein structures. In this slide, I have shown you an example of thyrodoxine, where in the center you can clearly see the beta sheets are twisted, and these beta sheets are connected by alpha helices. Tertiary structure. Tertiary structure arises due to interaction of side chains between the secondary structures. Each individual residue in tertiary structure exists in a most stable conformation, unless until very functionally required residues. Generally, all the hydrophobic residues are in the interior, and all the charged residues are on the surface. One of the example of globular domain tertiary structure is shown here is a myoglobin. In tertiary structure, almost all hydrogen bond acceptors donors are generally satisfied. If they cannot form hydrogen bond within itself, within the protein, they interact with the water. Globular proteins are tightly packed, and in the center, they are as tightly packed as a solid material. But as you move from the center to the surface, they are loosely packed near the surface. The low packing density indicates flexibility and movement and the functional role of that region. Quaternary structures. Different polypeptides or different tertiary structures or subunits come together to form a quaternary structure. Now, these domains could be a single polypeptide or different polypeptides. The subunits can be a similar type or different type. The similar type of subunit ones we call as the homotropic quaternary structures, and if you have different kinds of subunits, we call them as a heterotropic quaternary structures. These quaternary structures generally have internal symmetry. Example is a hemoglobin, but here in the example I have shown you lactate dehydrogenase, which is a heterotropic quaternary structure. Another example of quaternary structure is aspartate transcarbamylase. The aspartate transcarbamylase is very complex structure where you have 6 catalytic units and 6 regulatory units. The catalytic units form trimers and regulatory units form dimer, and the regulatory units come and interact between the 2 trimers. Now the quaternary structures have cooperativity in substrate binding. So when cooperativity means, so because you have multiple catalytic subunits, so if one binds to one substrate binds to one catalytic subunit, it enhances the active conformation of the secondary catalytic site. So that's how we call it as a cooperative substrate binding. And most of the quaternary structures have allosteric regulation. So they can have activators and they have a suppressors. So the regulatory subunits, what we have, where either activators or regulators or suppressors can bind to regulatory subunit, can enhance the conformation to increase the activity, or it also can change the conformation so that the activity is reduced. So that's why we call them as activators or suppressors, which bind to regulatory subunits. Now quaternary structures have several advantages, like they have less surface to volume ratio to do a better function, and they also have a genetic economy and efficiency. So if these kind of quaternary subunit containing enzymes are involved in a biological functions or pathways where you don't want to generate the product constantly. If the final product is synthesized, it should come back, bind to regulatory subunit, and inhibit the activity so that it synthesizes the less product. The stabilizing forces in the protein structures. We studied the ones which form other than peptide bonds. We have disulfide bonds, which connects the cysteine-cysteine residues. These disulfide bridges are generally long-range interactions. They are not neighboring residues which interact with each other. In the primary sequence, they could be from far away. Physiologically, in our body, it's a reduced environment. So generally SS bonds are reduced, but where they are exposed to oxygen or other places where SS bonds are formed. There are a number of ways SS bond can form, and this is very important question. If you have, let's say, 8 cysteines in a protein, so it can form 7 into 5 into 3 into 1, that is 105 conformations. So if you have a more number of cysteines, so basically you multiply. If you have n cysteines, you multiply n minus 1, n minus 3, n minus 5, and so on, so on, so on. That will give a number of possible ways thus a disulfide bridge can be formed. Disulfide bonds in protein folding. So the question is the disulfide bridges are very important for protein folding or protein stability? We can do a simple experiment and discuss this. Like example, ribonuclease. It has 8 cysteines. So you can denature the ribonuclease with 8 molar urea and DTT. So 8 molar urea will denature all the secondary structures, all the molecular interactions, and DTT will reduce the disulfide bridges. So we can refold ribonuclease in 2 different ways. One, first remove DTT, so you allow the disulfide bridges to form, and second, you remove the urea first. So where you allow it to fold. So where you remove the DTT first and urea later, that means you first allow the disulfide bridges to form and protein to fold. Then when you do this kind of experiment, you only get 1% of the activity back. If you do other way, first you remove the urea, that means you allow the protein to fold first, and remove DTT, and then that means you allow the disulfide bridges to form after the protein is folded. Then you get 99% of the activity retained. So what does it imply? So if you allow the disulfide bridges to form first, you get only 1% of activity. If you allow the disulfide bridges to form after the protein is folded, you almost get 100% activity. That clearly indicates SS bond is not important in protein folding, maybe in the stability. Now, another question I would like to ask is, why only 1% of activity is retained when you allow the disulfide bridges to form first? As we discussed before, ribonuclease has 8 cysteines. 8 cysteines means it can form 105 conformations. So out of 105 conformations, only 1 conformation is active. So 1 out of 105 is approximately 1%. And that's how you have only 1% of activity when you allow the disulfide bridges form to first, but when you allow the protein to fold first, the cysteines come in exact position where the protein is in active form. So disulfide bonds, we said, are not important in protein folding. Can we apply the same for the insulin? Can we do same experiment with insulin where you denature and refold with insulin? You won't get active insulin in any way because insulin has 2 chains. It's not of single chain. But you can do the same experiment with pre-proinsulin and it can fold back similar to ribonuclease. But whereas if you do the same experiment with mature insulin, it cannot be folded back because disulfide bridges are between the two polypeptides. Non-covalent interactions. All these protein structures are stabilized basically by several non-covalent interactions. The electrostatic interactions, hydrogen bonds, metallic bonds, hydrophobic interactions are major dominant non-covalent interactions. Like electrostatic interaction is where positive charge residue interacts with the negative charge residue. I will describe further details in the next slides, but example, the arginine positive charge residue interacts with the glutamic acid or aspartic acid or negative charge residue to form as salt bridges, or basically the ones which we can call them as electrostatic interactions. Hydrogen bonds. Hydrogen bonds are the hydrogen is involved, hydrogen is connected to a electronegative atom and which interacts with another electronegative atom where lone pair of electrons from the other atom it attracts. And these for details of hydrogen bonds are again discussed in the next slide. The metallic bonds. Several proteins which are actually stabilized by several metallic clusters which give stable structures. The more dominant forces in the protein structure is hydrophobic interactions, where many atoms which do not have charge, hydrophobic by themselves describe that water repelling properties or water phobic properties. So these examples in all the protein atoms, we have carbon, and carbon which do not have any charge like nitrogen and oxygen, they try to come together, and these are also described as van der Waals interactions. I will describe all these interactions in more detail in coming slides. Electrostatic interactions. Electrostatic interactions are also called as the salt bridges. In proteins, they are formed between the carboxyl group of aspartic acid or glutamic acid with guanidinium group of arginine or amino group of lysine. So electrostatic interactions, they follow a similar electrostatic interaction which you studied in the school. They follow Coulomb's law. So basically the energy is directly proportional to Q1 Q2 divided by R. So it's basically the product of the charges divided by the distance between these charges. Electrostatic interactions are the salt bridges in the protein structure are about 2.8 angstroms. The energy contribution due to electrostatic interactions in the water is about 12 to 17 kilojoules per mole, whereas in the hydrophobic environment, its contribution is about 30 kilojoules per mole. That means in the hydrophobic environment, their role is much larger. So in the water, the strength is less because water also can form interact ionic interactions. So therefore, the salt bridges are more stronger in the core of the protein where they are in the hydrophobic environment, but on the surface their contribution to the protein structure is less. Hydrogen bond. Hydrogen bonds are weak electrostatic interactions, but they have a directional property. So the direction of hydrogen from one electronegative atom should be in the same plane as the next electronegative atom. The two electrons are there. If they are in the same plane, the strength is larger. As it becomes perpendicular, the strength becomes very weak. So in proteins generally we have hydrogen bonds between N, H and O. The hydrogen bond distance is about 2.7 to 3.5 angstroms. It's generally about 3 angstroms. The energy contribution of hydrogen bond in water is about 2 to 6 kilojoules per mole, whereas if they are buried in the hydrophobic environment, they are 12 to 30 kilojoules per mole. So similar to ionic interactions, because the hydrogen bond can also form with water, the strength becomes very less, but in the hydrophobic environment, it cannot interact with anything else, and the energy because of the hydrogen bond in the hydrophobic environment becomes stronger. As we are discussing about the importance of each non-covalent interactions, so we will make a hypothesis that the hydrogen bonds are important for structural stability. So we can design an experiment or look into the data available, and we can discuss whether this these interactions, the hydrogen bond is important for structural stability. Like example, in favor of hydrogen bond as an important force in the structural stability, like melting point and boiling point of water is high as good as a hydrogen bond, and protein denature as the temperature increases. That means what? As the temperature increases, you are breaking the hydrogen bonds and you are denaturing the protein. That clearly says that hydrogen bonds are important for the protein structure. And similarly, the proteins have an internal architecture like helices and beta sheets. If the hydrogen bonds were not so important, then we would not expect alpha helices and beta sheets in the protein structure. Now, these are the points which will help us support the hypothesis that hydrogen bonds are important for the structural stability. But we can also argue the other way. Now, I'll tell you the few points here. Like example, if the hydrogen bonds are important, then they could interact with polyethylene glycol, glycerol, which are actually hydrogen bond forming reagents. So instead of making hydrogen bonds within the protein, they could actually do hydrogen bond with polyethylene glycol or glycerol. But actually, instead of these agents, PEG and glycerol, denaturing the protein, they actually stabilize the protein. Now, again, the same argument you can extend it. If the hydrogen bonds are very important in the protein structure, then protein should have a similar kind of structure irrespective of side chains. So, even though different side chains, they should have a similar structure like alpha helix and beta sheets, but all the proteins do not have a similar kind of structure. Now, we can take another example, is a very important example, is N-methyl acetamide. N-methyl acetamide is the smallest peptide mimicking reagent, which is very similar to amino acid backbone. Now, if you take this molecule in water, chloroform and DMSO, so in the chloroform at very low concentrations it forms dimer. But if you take it to DMSO, it needs little more higher concentration. And if you take it to water, it needs almost 10 molar to form dimers. So what does it explain? It explains that the hydrophobic environment in chloroform, this NMA, N-methyl acetamide, forms the dimer. So that clearly says that the N-acetyl acetamide is not forming hydrogen bonds when it can form hydrogen bond with water. It only forming hydrogen bond when there is a hydrophobic environment. The importance of hydrogen bond in the structural stability we can discuss. So if you make a hypothesis that hydrogen bonds are important in the structural stability. So if the hydrogen bond is dominant force, all the proteins should have a similar structure independent of the amino acids. But that is not correct. Generally, the proteins, the carbonyl groups form 9% beta sheet or 25% alpha helix, 5% turns, 19% loops and irregular, remaining interact with water. So that means the hydrogen bonds are not so dominant. Hydrophobic interactions. The interaction between the non-polar atoms, basically, as we say hydrophobic, the water repelling property, so they repel water and interact with each other. Something like example, micelle formation of oils or lipids to reduce the surface area and have a less contact with water. Soluble globular proteins hide hydrophobic core residues in the core as similar to micelle formation. Now, how does the energy contribution due to hydrophobic interactions? Suppose if you have two atoms far away, there is no interaction between them. Of course, there is no interaction between them, there is no force between them. But these two atoms starts coming close to each other. The nucleus of one atom starts to interact with the electron cloud of the other atom, and similarly, the electron cloud of one atom interacts with the nucleus of the other atom. But as they come together, the interaction energy between them becomes increased. But when they come closer, the electron cloud and nucleus repel much more robustly, and they repel from there. The attractive and repulsive forces are described by Lennard-Jones potential, and here where you have attractive forces and the are lowest is basically what we call as a distance, the minimum least energy, minimum most distance needed, but where the attractive forces and repulsive forces are equal and they don't change, contribute any energy, is actually we call a van der Waals distance. And as the two atoms come much closer, the repulsion energy becomes very high, as shown in the curve. Importance of hydrophobic interaction in structural stability. Similarly, you can have a hypothesis how important are these hydrophobic interactions. So you can do set of experiments in supporting or disproving the importance of hydrophobic interactions. So example, the organic solvent denature the protein. So that means they disturb the hydrophobic interactions and they denature the protein. So that indicates that hydrophobic interactions are important. And similarly, the ionic strength and hydrogen bond strength increases as when we add organic solvents, but the proteins still denature. Another point is the proteins have hydrophobic residues in the core, and that clearly says the importance of the hydrophobic residues. But to disprove this, you can always say, then if the hydrophobic interactions are so stable, why should they have internal architecture? Another way, you can always say, as the temperature increases, the hydrophobic interactions become stronger. But in the case of proteins, as the temperature increases, the protein denature. So you can also have a counter arguments for the hypothesis of importance of hydrophobic interactions. So as I said, every point we have discussed have positive points and the negative points. But the protein structure is actually the combination of all interactions which make it stable structure. Dear students, so this will be the summary of this module. Now we learned different interactions, non-covalent interactions, how they are stabilized. Now each non-covalent interactions we also discussed about how do you calculate the energy of each contribution of each non-covalent interaction. Here I am listing out how do we calculate the energy of total protein structure. Like if you have a total protein structure, you could have a bonded interactions and non-bonded interactions. Non-bonded interactions we have discussed throughout the chapter, last few slides. The bonded ones also play a role like bond length, bond angle, a dihedral angle. Now the bond length is not always constant in protein structures. So when we say carbon-carbon distance is 1.54 angstroms, it's not exactly 1.54 angstroms all the time. 1.54 is the lowest energy state, but at room temperature, which has some energy, unlike biological temperature, which we are at 37 degrees, you still have energy. So the bonds can fluctuate. And similarly, the bond angle. The bond angle also can have like sp3 hybridization. If you have 104 degrees approximately, but it's not necessary that it has to be always that angle. And the dihedral angle. And dihedral angle, you all know that cis and trans conformation also cause energy difference. So all these bonded interactions also contribute to the total energy of the protein. The non-bonded interactions, as we discussed before, the electrostatic interactions, van der Waals interactions and hydrogen bonds, where the energy terms are described before. Now all these terms together will give you the total energy of the protein structure. Now where do we use this total energy of the protein structure? Now this is basically we use this to minimization of the protein structure, when we do dynamics of the protein structure, or when we refine the structure of NMR and crystal structures. Now let me remind you that energy of the protein structure is a relative term. It only tells from one starting point to the end point whether you are going in a low energy state or higher energy state, but it does not tell you whether this is the lowest energy level. Like example, you can also use this energy calculations for binding of inhibitors or ligands or protein-protein interactions. If a small compound, if binds to your protein active site or on the surface somewhere, and that can reduce the energy of your protein structure. So that if the energy is reduced, that is a favorable interaction. And if the energy is not reduced, if it goes up, it is unfavorable interactions. So this can be also used in your in silico drug screening methods. And thank you.